Guys, what is the first money watch? If you answered Rolex, stay tuned. Me and Marco are going to tell you a few more facts as to why Rolex is the most popular brand. Marco, first of all, thank you for having me on your podcast. I was feeling left out yesterday when you and Adrian were filming videos, and I'm like, why am I not in it? Like I was having FOMO, serious FOMO actually.
Last I checked, Roman, I'm pretty sure this is your company. No, I'm just kidding.
I wanted to give you two contrast views on Rolex. One from, I guess, a veteran that sold a ton of Rolexes in the last 20 years, and two from our prodigy Marco that knows everything there is to know about Rolex, and sort of tie the two together, not in a boring way, but while still giving you some serious facts. And I think the best place to start, where I always love to start, is the history of it, going back to 1920.
I mean, there's like the earlier history when, you know, Hans Wilsdorf worked on kind of watches in England, and then he founded Rolex later in 1920 in Geneva, Switzerland. Obviously, that's where it's still headquartered today. I mean, it's one of the most historic brands ever of all time, right? And there's so much that they've done to advance the watch industry, going back to, let's say, 1928, when they first invented the oyster case, right? 1926, there you go.
You think I don't know something?
There you go. So I know a guy who knows a guy, thankfully. But yeah, oyster case, first dust-proof watch, was also the first water-resistant case of a watch, which was really groundbreaking, right?
That really goes back to the pre-Geneva days when they were sending watches from England to the main continent, quote unquote, and these things would come in rusty, because it took some time back then. They didn't exactly have turbojets and boats.
Right. They relied mostly on train and or, you know, travel by water. But if it would have been going across the English Channel, for example, things of that nature, you know, obviously it's very humid. Water could easily penetrate into cases, no problem at all. If we keep going right into the 30s, they're the first brand to create a wristwatch with a perpetual winding system, the automatic rotor as we know today, which is, you know, widely used in watches. Okay, taken for granted, kind of like our discussions with chronograph, right? Time and time again, it's an underrated complication having an automatic winding rotor, but to be the first to do something, right, that is truly groundbreaking.
You have no idea how many clients I've had buy an automatic watch, call me, be like, hey, my watch is not working. Well, did you wind it? Well, no, because it's an automatic. I'm like, well, you know, when the spring unwinds and runs out of juice, it's like taking a spoon of gasoline, throwing it into an empty tank and car, expecting it to go and keep going, right?
Right, exactly.
But so many times with that. But the automatic movement of the rotor, right, the one that basically winds your watch as you wear it from the movement of the wrist, it's a big deal. Yeah. It's in it's in every automatic watch.
Yeah, it's literally, I mean, there's new variations like a micro rotor, but that's done more as like a horological flex, if you will. It's like, I can do this, so I'm going to show you I can do it.
Which is basically a smaller rotor that does the same job, right?
Exactly.
The bigger the rotor, the easier it is to wind the watch.
Correct.
But the smaller it is. Then you have the rotors that go around the outer
there's
rings
peripheral
of the
rotors, things of that nature, right? But again, all of those are based in what Rolex originally did, right? Even moving forward, right, we're talking about some of the things that they did. 50s, they got really busy, right? Sir Edmund Hillary summited Everest with it was technically an Oyster Perpetual, if I'm not mistaken, or Oyster Precision at the time. They ultimately made the Explorer line in 1953 to commemorate that. They also conquered the air with the GMT Master 2. They conquered the seas with the release of the Rolex Submariner, I think, also in 1953, right? So again, that was a very busy period for them. 1960s come in, that's when we start to see obviously the release of the Daytona, probably the most iconic watch of all time.
Rolex managed to conquer the air, to conquer the water, to conquer speed, and to conquer extreme conditions in the likes of climbing Mount Everest.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So they conquered everything that you could technically on Earth. I think the only thing that they haven't done is, really space. That's the only thing that Omega, which is kind of the arch nemesis or arch rival of Rolex today, beat out Rolex. But I mean, it's not really a competition anymore, right? Because Rolex beat them out in pretty much everything else other than the kind of man's conquest to space, which is why I think Rolex probably didn't make a space watch today, right? It wouldn't make sense. Omega already did it. Why would Rolex?
I mean, unless they did something that's really crazy and out of this world, but we both know that Rolex would never do that. Rolex sticks within their sort of basic lines. It's seemingly same thing year in, year out, so I don't see Rolex stepping outside of that box. And you know what? I give them respect for that as well. Like, if Omega got space, let them have the space.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think all those things kind of factored into Rolex becoming the most popular brand, right? You conquer the air, you conquer the sea. I mean, we just kind of went past it, right? They beat out Omega for the COMEX contract with the release of the Sea Dweller. Actually, the Sea Dweller, they just released the Ultra. Actually, Omega released the Ultra Deep this year, and then Rolex released the Ultra Deep kind of deep sea challenge, whatever.
You mean that the 50 millimeter monster in titanium? Now, what people missed in that entire watch is, yes, we understand that a 50 millimeter watch is not a watch you're going to wear. It's ridiculous, right? Even though they made it out of titanium and it's super light, but it was the technology behind it and what that watch achieved.
You know, it's funny, right? Because you see so many people online hate on Rolex. Oh, we just see the same things over and over again, same things over and over again. And finally, they do something that pushes the boundaries of what they've done before and pushes the boundaries of what has been done, right? Omega got a ton of praise for the Ultra Deep that they released this year, which is also like a 45 millimeter watch, huge, ginormous thing, like 20.
I think it's basically a big square.
Right, and then the Rolex comes in. It has double the water resistance, right? So far more impressive watch. It's the first titanium Rolex. Maybe a sign of things to come. You know, more titanium in the future. Okay, maybe that's not groundbreaking, but at least it's something new, right? It's a step in the right direction. And again, Rolex going back to their roots of innovation, right? Doing something that they've never done before.
Extreme innovation, let's call it.
Right, because again, that's what Rolex was always about, right? Again, we go back to this idea, they conquered the land, they conquered sea, they conquered the air. This is what Rolex was all about, pushing the boundaries of what humans are capable of doing with Rolex watches on their wrist.
I'm gonna tie this back to something else. Ultimately, Rolex was a tool watch, right? And that's what it's known for. You know, it wasn't known for their dressy stuff. It was known to be a tool watch. Lots of things, like, forget climbing Mount Everest. How about the pulsometer, right? Guess what? It was a watch that a doctor actually used to measure your pulse, right? How about watches that were anti-magnetic, where now it seems like a moot point because most watches are anti-magnetic, but the original Milgauss, 50...
Yeah, that was actually also in the 50s, 56. Yeah, 56.
So the original Milgauss was an anti-magnetic watch. It allowed people to be in an environment with a watch that would keep proper time and be shielded from magnetic fields.
Actually originally used by CERN scientists, literally released originally in 1954. The prototypes were used by CERN scientists. IWC comes out 1 year later with the IWC Ingenieur in 1955, and then Milgauss is released in serial production in 56.
You mix that with the achievements, which is the modern day marketing, if you think about it. That modern day marketing is, you know, the ambassadors that we have today, the social media, all these fancy video reels that you can see of a watch showed in a beautiful way. Back then, you didn't have all that. What did you have? You had specific events, you had specific tasks that were accomplished.
Rolex was always the tool watch, right? And it became something else over time in that it captured, I guess, the attention, the minds of people as maybe the best built watch for the specific purpose it was made for, and then later became, I mean, something that you mentioned, right, which was the first money watch. And that was really a transitional period because Rolex really became a status symbol, right? Having a Rolex watch was always expensive. Rolex watches were never cheap, even when a Submariner was $200, right? You have to factor in inflation, cost of living.
But what were they charging for? They were charging for what you just said, a quality, well-made watch that's going to do the job.
Absolutely.
A Swiss Army knife is a good Army knife, right? But there are plenty of other knives out there today that are not as good. And it really came down to quality. And back then, it was a question of this tool watch doing its job, performing under certain conditions in order to do the one thing it was designed to do, and that is to tell time.
Yeah, and again, we go back to this idea they conquered the air, sea, land, but they also conquered the hearts and minds of people, right? Because
let's talk about speed.
What they were able to do was also, I mean, speed is one thing, right? But also immerse themselves in popular culture, right? How many times have we heard the word, I have a Rolex on my wrist in a rap song or a hip hop song?
I got a better one for you. The Rolex is so known, it's so popular that you can be in the middle of the desert dying of thirst, and if you have a Rolex, you can buy 6 camels and 6 wives to go along with it, right? That's just how known that watch is.
Yeah, it's a power of branding for sure. And I think one thing that has helped Rolex is their designs, right? If you look at a Rolex Submariner when it was originally released in 1953, all the way up until a 124060, right? Because original Submariner was a Note 8 sub. You still see that consistent lineage, right? They make sense.
It looks almost the same. From far, if your vision is not 100%, an old school Rolex versus a new school Rolex, you can have a Rolex on your wrist that's 50 years apart and they look the same.
Correct, yeah. It's unmistakable, right? The design language, the character of their watches, the way that they're built. again, we talk about Rolex being kind of a shell of itself, right? In the sense that they make the same things over and over again, just making small incremental changes. But everything that they've done over time has been to improve the quality of their watch, the build quality, right? They got to a certain point where movement-wise, the caliber 3100 family couldn't get any better, right? That was a long-running movement, probably about 20, 30 years in their watches. But what did they do? They built other things that would improve their watches. Ceramic bracelets, or ceramic bezels rather. They also added a new kind of system in the clasp, and then they upgraded the bracelet steel.
How about the ceramic tubes inside the bracelet to make it tighter?
I mean, even the steel that they use, right? In the reference 168,000 Submariner, right? They went to the surgical steel, the 904L that they use today, which is, you know, super high grade surgical steel. Then they also, for example, added maxi dials, right? Bigger lume plots to make their watches more legible.
Oh, the lume plots in its own, from the use of radium to then tritium and
Luminova, super
Luminova now.
Yep.
All those things are improving as the time's improving, technology is improving. But you mentioned one little thing that I want to touch upon: subtle changes, right? You talked about subtle changes. Like I said, you look at a sub from the 50s all the way out to today; they all seemingly look the same. But I believe that it's this very factor that also makes Rolex one of the most collectible brands in the world, because all those little subtle changes. You pick up a Rolex book, yay thick, and you can go just to the Submariner line. It can take you weeks upon weeks just to figure out all those little subtle changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what the best part about it is there's no information out there. Rolex, by the way, is terrible with their records.
Yeah,
they're so terrible with their records. Like, I think anything past the 70s is like, forget about it.
It's pretty much conjecture.
Yeah, exactly. But what the collector market has achieved, by having that big great unknown, it made it even more exciting. So what are collectors doing nowadays? They're looking for those subtle changes, and they say, oh, okay, this lume plot just increased by 0.5 millimeter, and that happened between the year of this and this, and I only did that for a year. Total production for that year was about this, and therefore there's only so few of these. This is more collectible than the other.
Right.
Then we get into things like condition. Then we get into things like papers, original box, original hang tags. Like, I had a few Rolexes that I had it down to the original receipt of purchase. But what makes the Rolex brand so collectible is because you know exactly what you're going to get, and you look for those subtle changes that happen over the last 50, 60 years, and you say, oh my God, I have the one watch that turned tropical. Let's say, let's talk about the Bakelite. The
6542.
The Bakelite GMT, like, so from 57 to 59 roughly, you know, they made it with radium. There was a whole scandal about people getting cancer and all the whole to-do, and then they switched out of radium, and guess what? You know that dial cannot turn tropical anymore. All those little subtle changes makes Rolex collecting, I think, most exciting.
Yeah.
I compare it to my collection of antique weapons. So if you get into an era of bolt action rifles, right, really, you know, mid 1800s to early 1900s, right, there's so many little subtle changes, but they meant so much for the technology of that particular rifle that, to me as a collector, I go ape shit. Therefore, I have 900 different ones because there was so many different little things that were made in between. And to go back to the world of rifles, notice I mentioned innovation and technology. The amount of innovation, the amount of research, the amount of time that went into taking a watch and having somebody scale Mount Everest with, or taking a watch, tying it to the bottom of a submarine and you know, going from America damn near as deep as China, then coming out on the other side. It's sort of like what NASA did in the last few years. How much did we actually get out of it? Because most people, which is why I took that post down, most people look at that watch and say, oh, that 50mm behemoth. They completely forget about the achievement behind it, what it took to create that watch, the amount of testing, the amount of research and development that goes into that. So all those...
And Rolex actually partnered closely with Comex to develop that kind of a watch that can reach that level of water resistance, right? So again, showing that they're not unwilling to push the boundaries of what can be done, right?
So we, on a consumer market or as a human race, these seemingly overlooked achievements at their time were a big to-do because a lot of things came out of that. We're getting deep and geeky into it, but you know, the topic is, why is Rolex so popular? And then to, you know, what we just talked about, obviously the history behind it, the consistency behind it, the achievements that they made throughout time, and the fact that this was a big tool watch. But then we could jump into things like the Daytonas. Yeah. That's where iconicism comes in, I feel like.
Right. Well, let me piggyback firstly, before we get into the Daytona, off of that idea that Rolex was a tool watch, right? And again, we get into this era where they start taking over popular culture. Now, you've been doing this about 20 years, a little bit more. what was Rolex back then versus what it is today, right? I know when you started, you tell me all the time, right? Frank Muller was the big brand, right? AP wasn't what it is today, Patek even, Rolex even. What was Rolex, and what did you see like over time that those changes from again, that big brand?
So when I started, I think the only difference between 20 years ago versus today, I'll tell you what the similarities were. It was still the #1 selling brand, believe it or not, right? So it was still the most popular selling brand. It was that first money watch 20 years ago as it is a first money watch today. My first fancy watch was a Rolex. When I walked into the room, my Rolex walked in first, and then make sure everybody saw it, and then I walked in, right? So that stands true. Availability was different. Rolex was available. You could walk into a dealer, you can buy a Rolex, any Rolex that you wanted.
Right.
Daytona was the only watch that wasn't readily available.
Yeah.
At the time, the retail was $5,900. Or was it $69? It was cheap.
Yeah.
So whatever the retail was back then, it was still trading around $9,000 to $10,000. So it was still trading at a good 30–40% over list. That stayed consistent throughout. Daytona is still that one product. As of late, Rolex became an investment, right? That wasn't true when I started. I've preached for years that watches are not an investment because I come from those times where they weren't.
Yeah.
Right? People were not paying buku dollars. Auctions weren't fetching millions of dollars for Paul Newmans and things of that nature. Yeah, they were up there in price, but not extravagant as they are today.
Yeah.
Over time, the world started seeing watches as that investment, and who's going to be the first culprit of that? The #1 selling brand, right? And that's Rolex. That's why we arrived from 20 years ago today to the fact that pretty much every Rolex is overlist. No Rolex is available. You have little things say display model only in every Rolex boutique, and people are waiting in line to get them because they got caught up in the hype of the money side of it, the investment side of it.
Yeah.
That did not exist 20 years ago.
But they also nailed, I think, retail psychology, which is you want what you can't get or you can't have, right? Which is,
oldest trick in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how they did it, but especially making 1 million+ watches a year, but it's nothing short of spectacular, right? And I like to use at least a reference point of when I think at least the popularity of Rolex really exploded, right? Because prior to the Paul Newman Daytona auction, it seemed that Rolex watches were available. 2017, right? And end of 2017, Rolex watches were available, right? You could get a Daytona, you could order a special order, a steel Daytona from an AD. Maybe you get it in 6 months, 8 months.
A year.
Right, you didn't need prior purchase history like you need today, right? I mean, getting a Daytona with no purchase history, forget about it, right? So I like to use that as a reference point, right? It seems like in 2017, when the Paul Newman Daytona auction happened, the world was flipped upside down, the watch industry at least, in that Rolex became seemingly a lot less available. It became not only a first money watch, but a watch that you can now invest in and potentially see amazing returns, right? That's what we discussed, me and Adrian, yesterday, which is nothing short of spectacular, right? This idea that you can wear a watch, enjoy it for a couple of years, and sell it at a profit. It had never been seen.
It didn't exist before.
Right. It never been seen before, right? In your opinion, what caused that change? Do you think Paul Newman Daytona auction played a role, or
I think the Paul Newman auction played a huge role. Auctions in general, they play a general role in the watch market, right? Some are positive, some are negative. For the most part, I've always said auctions are not a marker, but a bit of an indication, but not a true marker, because anything can happen in an auction environment, right?
It shows kind of buyer sentiment. Are we in a bull market, bear market, that kind of thing?
That I will agree. Yeah. It will show you a little bit of markers, but not numbers that are set in stone. Just because something fetched a low number or high number in that world doesn't mean that sets the price. It's the secondary market that sets the price. That's the reality of it, right? It's what this watch is worth on the secondary market, i.e. gray market, right? What I think did it was every once in a while, every auction would have outliers, right? So if you look at the last few auctions, talk about your favorite independents, George Daniels fetched $4.2 million in auction. His plainer watch fetched over $1 million in auction. That's what I like to call outliers, things that realistically just attract attention. Right. For people that are not into watches, a person that has never considered buying a watch sees something that's an outlier, something that's a wow, right? A headline, if you will. Yeah. It gets them interested. And when that Rolex in 2017 fetched a number which was an outlier, it captured the attention of people that either never thought about buying a watch because it made all the news, right? Or people that were perhaps buying other things and never even considered Rolex, because there were a lot of collectors out there that wouldn't be caught dead wearing that first money watch, that cliche Rolex, right? For most, you know, a gold Rolex was a retirement watch, very cliche, right? And now all of a sudden, like, oh my God, what happened with that Paul Newman? What did they start doing? Oh, well, I'm not spending millions on a vintage Rolex right now, but I would like to look into vintage. That year, the entire vintage Rolex market went up by about 40%.
Wow.
Old single red subs, double red subs. You know, I owned my single red sub for like $8,000. A month after that auction, I was offered double that. I didn't sell it, right? And then it potentially went up to like almost $40,000 already for a nice clean, you know, example, right? And then, like everything else, markets fluctuate and the vintage market fluctuates. But at the time that that happened, it really was that outlier result, that attention grabbing, that news headline, if you will. They made a lot of people open their eyes to the world of Rolex saying, oh my God, that is so collectible. That's not a Patek minute repeater that fetched that, you know, for a change. It's not a $24.99. Huh?
Right. It's when you put it in context of the watch industry, it was. I mean, it's still to this day extremely unique in that it's still the second highest grossing auction result ever by a watch. Right. The only other one is the Patek Philippe Grandmaster Chime, which passed it 2 years later, only watch auction in 2019. Right.
But that's not even. Here's the thing. That's not even a marker because most people look at that as the outlier of outliers.
Right, because it took almost a decade to make that wristwatch. You know what I mean? Yeah. So versus a Paul Newman Daytona was serially produced, but it was just, you know, owned by Paul Newman. I mean, I think 9 out of 10 of the highest grossing auction results were by Patek, right? So Rolex that one is the only unique one. The only other one I could think of is the Unicorn Daytona. I think John Goldberger actually owned that one with the white gold bracelet, right? That was a one-of-a-kind piece unique.
If you want to talk about popularity, we got to talk about the ultimate, the chronograph, the Daytona, what it represents, the people behind it, because Paul Newman, if I was living in that age, I would want to be Paul Newman.
Yeah, no doubt about it, right? And again, even just you look at, in terms of silhouettes of a watch, right? I don't think, or even design of a watch, I don't think it gets better than the Daytona. Like, there's something about it that when you hold, you just can't explain it. You hold the Daytona in your hands, and you just know it's a special watch, right?
How about recognizing it from afar, the silhouette?
But there's also, like, even just, you can't explain it. It's like Richard Mille, right? Prior to working here, I was like, Richard Mille, like, then they're nice watches, but I don't know. But you hold one of their watches, and there's just that, we say in French, 𝗕𝗰𝗲𝗄. It's the
I was going to say the same thing actually. 𝗕𝗰𝗲𝗄. Yeah.
It's like I don't know what it is, but it's there, it's present, you know, kind of thing. And it's exactly that with the Daytona, right? You just know it's something special. Now, let me move away from the Daytona. Let me ask you. We've gone through kind of current market, how it is basically established itself as the most popular brand in the world today. Will there ever be a time you think that maybe people get frustrated with the Rolex brand, or will it last, right? Will Rolex continue to be this dominant player as it has been?
Well, let's start with the fact that Rolex, in every category, if you will, or every market that you want to look at in terms of placement, Rolex is number one and number two is way down there. Yeah. So there's a big gap between number one and number two and the rest, a humongous gap. In my opinion, it doesn't go away. Look at what Rolex is doing currently, right? Look at their involvement. Let's start with tennis. Let's go to F1 racing. Let's look at various types of racing, not just F1, right? Let's look at where Rolex is today in terms of ambassadors, in terms of what sports they're involved in. Notice, still extreme things of our day. Right. F1 is a very extreme sport. Tennis may not be an extreme sport, but a very mainstream sport, a very popular sport worldwide. Key is worldwide, right? Tennis is worldwide. F1 is worldwide. It's not the NFL, right? It's not baseball. It's worldwide sports that have a humongous following. And the ambassador that they choose, I mean, Roger Federer. What, do I need to go further?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? For F1, they don't even have a driver. They sponsor the whole damn thing. Yeah. You know, the clock that sets off the race is a Rolex clock that goes and they go, right? It's a big, big, big deal. And Rolex is going to continue that route simply because Rolex has money. They're going to continue sponsoring big names, big sports, big events, and be the name in front of as many eyes as possible. They're using the oldest trick in the book. They're getting in front of a humongous or a huge amount of eyes, and the right kind of eyes. The kind of eyes that will buy their product and appreciate their product.
I think it also boils down to, I mean, just to tack on to what you said, right, which is one, they've fostered so much goodwill among their collectors, right? When you own a watch and then it suddenly appreciates big time, right, you're going to tend to like that brand. They've also fostered so much great brand equity. They're the most recognizable brand, status symbol, what have you, right? And then on top of it, they have just an amazing product. They truly are what I feel is like the Apple of the watch industry, right? They are in such a powerful position. They have a product that's so far superior in the minds of the average person that an iPhone will never be dethroned by a Samsung phone, right? Same kind of idea. A Submariner will never get dethroned by a Seamaster or frankly any other competitor. I just don't see it. So yeah, I think I'm right there with you. I don't think there's anything that can really stop Rolex going from strength to strength and continuing on the trajectory that they have, right? Again, we go back to when you first started, Rolex was still that first money watch, that status symbol, that watch. It was that watch, right?
And it still kept value,
right.
Except it was a little bit different. Like in the market I was in 20 years ago, if you bought a sub, I mean, wholesale, I was buying subs about $4,000 to $4,200, right? I just remember because I used to buy them, 30, 40 at a time. And it was one of those things that if I put it on a client's wrist, let's say if my cost was $4,200, let's say my client paid me $4,800 for it, right? When he went to bring that watch back pre-owned, I still bought it back for $3,800 to $4,000, right? Essentially, it was sort of a normal market, not like what we're experiencing today, where you basically take the profits off the table that you made on the watch, maybe a little less for the fact that it's pre-owned, buy it back for $4,000 and wholesale it for $42,000, $43,000, or retail it for $44,000, right? It was a normal concept, and Rolex, mind you, at the time, was the only watch and the only brand that had the shortest gap when it came to that. And what I mean by gap is like if I sold it for $5,000, I bought it back for $4,000 and resold it for $45,000. If we looked at any other brand, let's say take a Blancpain for example, if I sold it for $5,000, I'm now buying it back for $35,000 and selling it for $4,000. So that gap was much bigger on that resale end. And it stands true today. We've kind of come down in pricings with the market today. We don't have stuff trading at 17x its retail value, right? Yeah. But nothing changed. The Daytona is still the #1 seller. It's still trading over list. Let's say a stainless steel white Daytona brand new is trading at $30,000. We're buying that watch anywhere from 26 to 28, depending on how lucky we can get, selling it for 30, and then we're buying it back for 24, 25, and reselling it for 27, 28. Yeah. So that little tiny gap in between resale value, which is absolutely normal because this is what we do for a living. Right. We make money in between whenever we buy or sell, right? It's normal. But that gap is not 50, 60%. Like some of the other brands. So a lot of things stay consistent. And I think the most consistent thing that has stayed, anybody that gets into watches, if you ask anyone out there that has a budget up to $10,000 on a watch, if they're able to afford, the first watch they're going to reach for is a Rolex for their first watch. It's not an Omega. It's, although probably second best, it's not a Cartier. It's not a Breitling. Usually people reach for Breitlings or Omegas or let's say TAG Heuers or even Tudors, their second brand, that's really based on the fact that they can't really jump to a Rolex yet or afford one.
And I think also, I mean, we talk about a model for consistency, but also Rolex has been able to do something that they never were able to do before, right? Two-tone Daytonas, even two-tone period gold watches from Rolex, they were, I mean, for lack of a better term, they were dogs, right? They didn't sell at retail. A platinum Daytona, they would offer you as many steel Daytonas as you can buy if you bought one at retail. It was trading, 35, 40, 50 off. I mean, maybe not 50 off, I'm exaggerating
30
here, right?
off.
Right, but 30 off.
Dealer
right.
cost is 37 off
right.
on Rolex.
All day, right? So the idea is now, waitlisted piece, all gold Daytonas, Oyster Flex, watches on straps. A Rolex on a strap? Forget about it. Zenith Daytonas on a strap, nobody wanted those. But Rolex has been able to take every single one of, even I'm going
to tell you a story. I'm going to tie this to what you're trying to say together perfectly, right? When Rolex was able to get to a point where their hot models, Steel Daytona, Steel Skydweller, Steel Datejust 41s, all the seemingly popular, so the GMTs, the Pepsis, all those things had become so hot that they ended up becoming so hot that they brought up the rest of the dog stuff, as you mentioned, the strap Daytonas, the two-tone stuff, to where now I don't remember the last time I had an issue finding a 28mm ladies two-tone Datejust. That's a watch I could pick up on call for 30, 35 off from any authorized dealer. Today, you're paying list plus. And that's kind of the same concept.
And you're going to have a hard time finding it too.
It's kind of like the same concept. It's having, when your top stuff is able to bring up the stuff that's not as popular, there's no other brand in the world that's been able to do that. Not AP, not even Richard Mille. Nobody, because guess what? The round 𝗕𝗏𝗄 still not doing as hot. The rectangular 𝗕𝗏𝗄s are not doing as hot. You go into AP, you get into the millionaires, the 𝗕𝗏𝗬 𝗬𝗢𝗎𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍 I love the code 1159. I think they did a tremendous job with that watch. But in reality, people have it on their wrist because they bought that in order to get the Royal Oak, right? So that's the forced way to do it. Where with Rolex, it wasn't really forced. It just kind of went with the market. As the hot stuff kept going up and up and up and up, people realized, wait a minute, there's value in all this other stuff. Okay, it's two-tone. That's actually a better value. Let me pick that up. And all that stuff sort of caught on. And that's why Rolex is so powerful in doing this while, mind you, producing 1.1 almost million watches a year. I think that their distribution department, whatever you call that, you know, the department,
supply, demand chain, logistics, whatever.
The department that's responsible for distribution of these Rolexes among hundreds and hundreds of points of sales worldwide, while making 1 million+ watches a year and be able to keep the demand this tight, I take my hat off to Rolex.
Absolutely. Now, I want to ask you one last question before we wrap this up, because 10-minute video will become with us 10 hours, right? It's just like that. The one area that Rolex still lags behind is the dress watch market, right? You see the Cellini moon phase. They really did try, right? Even the Cellini line period, right? Obama was actually seen wearing a Rolex Cellini. Do you think Rolex will ever make a real stab at it? Because again, yes, they did the Cellini moon phase, but that was really the only one that I guess they really tried something different and off the beaten path to make it a success. Is that the only area that they need to conquer, or they're so popular they'll just forget about it? They don't. I
think if it ain't broke, if it's not broken, don't fix it, right? Let's go back to Frank Muller, right? Frank Muller was known for their tonneau shaped watches, right? It was, when I was coming up, that was the it watch to have. If you had a Frank Muller King Conquistador chronograph tonneau shape on a bracelet, you were the man, right? And it's a watch that traded at the time for more money than Daytona. And then they made a couple of round pieces.
Yeah.
They even went as far as making some super complicated, some of his perpetual calendars, retrogrades, and things like that, in that QP case or whatever it was called. It was a round watch. Nobody wanted them. You cannot go, you mentioned earlier, seemingly the same throughout the years with small, incremental, tiny little changes. The minute you flip something over, it doesn't go. I can name a ton of brands that this doesn't work for, to include Richard Mille, to include even Audemars Piguet, to include Rolex, and to include everybody else out there.
The only other one seemingly that can do it is Patek Philippe.
Well, Patek Philippe has always been there in terms of...
And that's only recently, because lest we forget, the sports is only the last 6 years.
Right, so we're going back to early 70s, right, where Genta obviously made the Nautilus, and that's when that sports started for them. But think about Patek and sports watches. What do you have? You have the Aquanaut and you have the Nautilus.
I mean, listen, we ran through in our video that's going to be released by the time this is released. Adrian ran through all the perpetual calendars, right? 15, 18, 24, 99, and so on. You go down the line. Each one has that consistent kind of design throughout, right?
Absolutely.
It's the only other brand that you see making those small incremental changes over time, not just across one watch, but across their entire lineup.
I'll give you the perfect answer to that. Go back to 1973 to Patek. So here comes Audemars Piguet. They make the ultimate luxury sports watch, the first luxury sports watch in stainless steel for some ridiculous amount of money for the time, $2,200 or something, where a Rolex costs $200, right? And Patek the following year goes, oh, wait a minute.
Actually, 76.
Laureata
was 73.
Laureata 73 and 76 on the Nautilus, right? And then Patek realizes, oh, wait a minute. They watched them for a couple of years. That kind of worked out for them. Let's do it as well. Imagine how an average Patek collector took to the Nautilus, or an average AP collector took to the Royal Oak in 1972 and 76. It's exactly the same thing that would happen today if tomorrow Rolex said, let me make a big dressy gold watch. It'll be the same exact effect, because people are going to be like, huh? Well, maybe in today's market, it could probably work because everything seems to be like flying off the shelves.
Whatever they do,
But the problem is you also have to look at the monetary perspective. People, as much as people like to think, watches are expensive, Rolex is like one of the cheapest brands out there, pound for pound, if you look at the retail pricing on their watches, the steel stuff to the gold stuff, right? And if they're going to make a dressy watch, it's going to be, I believe, on a price point where people are going to say, well, I'm not paying 40 grand for that rose gold moon phase, whatever it might be, not even a Cellini. I'd rather have a Sky Dweller. And that's what it comes down to. But overall, I think to answer the question as to why Rolex is so popular, let's just go right down the line. It's the history, it's the innovation, it's the projects they've been involved with, it's the fact that it started out as the ultimate tool watch and has a much longer span life of a sports watch than any other brand out there if you think about it. And last but not least, it's that first money watch. And I think that's a big factor. People look at it as a joke, but it's a big factor. Take 100 people, pull them in a room full of watches, give them a $10,000 budget, and put 10 brands in a room. The first brand they're going to walk over to is Rolex. And that's a power that cannot go away. That's a power that will never go away. So this brand is here to stay.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Roman, thank you so much for joining me. As always, it's a pleasure. Guys, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe for more in the future. Let us know down in the comments what you think. And of course, let us know what videos you'd like to see from us, right? Because we always love to make these. Guys, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you.
See you guys soon.